Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hey, welcome everybody to the Canadian edition of the SimplyTrade podcast. How are you guys doing out there today?
SimplyTrade A.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Hey, it's good to see all you folks out there today. You last saw us when, you folks were visiting us up in Ottawa for our IE Canada International Summit. It was a great time, right, Kim? Everybody had fun.
It was excellent, Warrington. Thank you so much for your leadership and your passion on that. It was one of our best for sure.
Yeah, we're having one next year, so keep tuned for that. But today, Kim and I were discussing this with Andy and Layla, and I think we thought it was time for a Canadian update based on the change in the U.S. administration and how the administration is, changing its direction on global trade policy. So that was really our objective today. So that's what the next 30 minutes are going to be about. And let's kick it off. So let's start with the political context here in Canada.
So, and I guess it's warranted too to timestamp, but I know this will go out early next week. But I think what is today? It's January 24th. So we're just concluding our first week under President Trump, and in our own journey here in Canada to try and figure out who might be our next prime minister.
Yeah, and I'll timestamp this at 11:07 a.m. Eastern too.
This is the backdrop to suck everyone into our amazing story we're going to tell here.
Yeah, unlike the United States, where the president has received a clear mandate from the citizens of the United States and Congress, that's not the case here. Most recently, the Prime Minister Trudeau, did resign, and we do operate under a British parliamentary system, and he was the head of the Liberal Party of Canada. And so technically, though, he still is the Prime Minister of Canada. But he is stepping down, and there now is a leadership race to replace him. And the three top candidates would be Mark Carney, who's an outsider, really. He was the previous governor of the Bank of Canada and governor of the Bank of England. Obviously, a smart dude, vested in economics, but he's not a political actor at all.
Never been elected.
Never been elected. No, he's a little rusty when it comes to getting in front of cameras and speaking. But he does have the largest support so far in the caucus. So that's very interesting. And then you have Chrystia Freeland, who was previously the deputy prime minister and finance minister under Trudeau. She probably is coming up second, I would think. And then Karina Gould, who was previously the House leader for the Liberals, is probably a distant third. She's a little younger and offers some attractive ideas for change within the party. But that all being said, that's going to work itself out on March 9th. So that's a little ways away, I guess. And then there's a period between March 9 and, say, March 24th, where we really don't know if Parliament is going to resume, because Parliament is not sitting right now, which is kind of unique because we're in the middle of this trade talk without federal leadership and Parliament. But anyway.
But other than that, it's all good.
It's all good. Yeah, we're still here. Yeah. And what you're seeing from Canada in regards to the response to the change in trade policy is a lot of voices from the Canadian premiers. And Danielle Smith, our premier in Alberta, she has a vested interest in the continuation of shipments of oil and gas. And then you have Premier Ford in Ontario, who Ontario probably represents about 40% of Canada's GDP. His primary interest is manufacturing, the supply of electricity, and other things into the United States. And he's going to announce an election next Wednesday, which is going to come to fruition on February 27th. So I think the key out of all of this is that you're hearing a lot of voices from Canada, right? You're not hearing a singular sort of consensus view. And so
And I think
that's
the
what's
other good
happening.
thing to point out is, Warrington, our election cycles are much shorter.
Yes, this is very true. Yes. So, but you can imagine that there's a lot of keen interest on the Canadian side about the change in the policy. And I think the most fundamental or the most prominent executive order that impacts Canada would be the executive order, which was titled America's First Trade Policy. And that the president wanted to basically do an investigation of the U.S. trade policy. And I think what I gather from the president is he feels that trade is somewhat out of balance. And when I looked at some manufacturing statistics, both in the U.S. and Canada, I think, surprisingly, the countries are saying the same thing. Like from 2000 to 2019, the United States effectively lost 5 million manufacturing jobs. But strikingly enough, over the same period, Canada lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 300,000, 350,000 jobs as well. So I think both countries have experienced this multilateral trade, and the more openness of trade hasn't really helped them in terms of domestic manufacturing, right? So I think that's a little out of balance, and I think that's what we're hearing from the president. And that review is being conducted by several agencies of the U.S. government, and they're to come back to the president by April 1st with their recommendations for change. In the interim, Canada's response to a proposal for 25% tariffs on goods flowing to the United States from Canada obviously is upsetting the Canadian government, and they've studied the implementation, or proposal anyway, for retaliatory tariffs. And what that would mean is if there's goods coming from the United States with U.S. origin into Canada, they would be subject to this retaliatory surtax, as we call them. And there's a number of proposals that have come forward. One was for $37 billion. One was for $110 billion. And now the conversation is, $594 billion, which is the basic trade that we have with the United States. So the net impact of all of this would mean is that you have 25% tariffs going south, 25% tariffs going north. Everybody's paying tariff, and I don't think anybody wins. Everybody kind of loses here. So that's the state of play. And I don't really want to be a negative nerd about it, but I think some of the positive things we've seen most recently with the change in the administration, and I know, Kim, you're closer to this, is we've seen a lot of work being done by USCBP and Canada Border Services on national security and security at Canada's border, right? There was concerns around the movement of people and drugs and weapons and things of that nature. And there's been a lot of work being done, at least on the Canadian side. The Canadians have invested, I think it was $1.3 billion in improvements to the U.S.-Canada border. I think the Ontario government as well is deploying provincial police officials to assist CBSA officials at the border. And there was several prominent arrests recently. So this is the kind of thing that we typically see in terms of U.S.-Canada activity. When we go back to 9/11, you had been involved with some significant work in improving security frameworks. And a lot of the stuff that we have today in regulation is an output of that work, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's a great way to segue into a little bit maybe more specific conversation about the security of the border. And I do think it's an important inflection point. And just for full disclosure, I used to be a customs officer, so I definitely see it from a different kind of lens from the security perspective in that way. And I do think, like, one of the things for sure I can say, and I know, is that the folks that do those jobs work so tirelessly on our behalf. But I do think President Trump has brought us to a really important conversation and inflection point, because the challenges that we have between our two countries and collectively together are probably bigger than the average citizen knows. I mean, it's because those law enforcement agencies are just working so hard to try and make our lives be, uneventful. We go out the door every day thinking life is great. We don't really understand what's going on behind the scenes and the issues that are happening. Because a lot of times it doesn't really impact us. It might impact a friend. But I think obviously around the fentanyl file specifically, we certainly have it in this country. I know the United States is really struggling with that. Probably everyone has had some level of contact, or I shouldn't say contact, but has been influenced or knows somebody that has been plagued with fentanyl, whether it's through addiction or death. Like, that's how serious this is now. And so I think that just raising everyone's awareness, but also, encouraging Canada or telling us, you got to help us protect the United States with your border, because we know that folks that are involved in this kind of activity are, they work on this full time. They know that if they can't get in one way, they move another way. So it's not unrealistic to know that they've moved through Canada and, now we're moving stuff down into the United States. Because it's an easier path potentially. So I think like that part of it was really important to raise awareness. And so, that's part of the discussion right now. I do think USCBP has also done an amazing job for decades, quite frankly, previous Trump administration, many administrations, to work very closely with the private sector. And I think Canada can learn from that. And I definitely am encouraged to see that we are starting to see some movement. And again, I think it's just more that kind of tendency from a law enforcement perspective to be insular. But because the task is so big, I think it's all hands on deck right now. And we definitely need the private sector to lean in, work together, share information, and make sure that we are not only keeping Canada's borders secure, but by default, also making sure that we're not a conduit into the United States for these kinds of things to be happening. So, from that perspective, I'm very encouraged with the discussion around the fentanyl file and, making sure that Canada understands their responsibilities. And so that's good. That's all good. And I have seen lots of agencies in Canada starting to now think about private sector and government working groups. So that, again, if we get that outcome, that is an amazing net win for everyone.
It's fascinating that we up here in Canada have been fighting interprovincial trade barriers for 20 plus years. Ever since I came into my professional life, we've been talking about it. And unlike the United States, I think there's a pretty easy flow of goods within the states. Cross borders, it's not really a big deal. In Canada, though, premiers have made this a science in of itself in sort of protecting their own interests. And what it's come up with, it's frankly, I'm unable to buy a bottle of wine directly from a BC winery when I live in Ontario. This is crazy. You think, well, how can that happen? Anyway, there seems to be some impetus now from the premiers to get this solved, and which is fantastic. There was issues in trucking and licensing and permitting and just little needle stuff that was preventing goods from crossing interprovincial borders. And if we get that benefit, that's like a $200 billion benefit of trade just within Canada that can be facilitated by this entire mess, which I think would be an even better outcome for everybody, right? So, when we try to size this thing, I mean, there's a lot of numbers floating around between, various political parties. And I don't want to get into that discussion today, but just so everybody understands, there's about $1.3 trillion worth of trade that happens between U.S. and Canada. So wherever you are, whether you're on the Canadian side or the U.S. side, our supply chains are fully integrated, and it's been that way since post-NAFTA, I would submit. So what does let's just talk some practical things that you should be thinking about with the current situation. So I should also suggest we don't know what the current situation really is. There's a date of February 1st out there, which we're not really sure what that means. And of course, there's that April 1st date, which is the review by the U.S. agencies. So I think the first thing that listeners really need to do is to be cognizant that something could happen on or after February 1st, 2025. Right? So if you're a business that's just joining us today and you said, whoa, what just happened? You sort of need to take a look at several things in your business. And these are the kinds of things that I have in mind. And I'm sure, Kim, you have some in mind. But I think the first thing is to conduct a supply chain review of your business, right? A holistic view of who you're trading with, what you're trading, and Kim, you can get into the details of the HS tarifications and so on. But you want to start to map these things out, right?
Yeah, that's a great point, especially from a U.S. product, because in the past, when we had retaliation, and we can obviously only glean from what happened in the past, it was origin specific. So we definitely know things coming out of the United States are not always of United States. United States brings in a lot of goods from various countries around the world and then ships them to Canada. So the last round, it was origin, very specific. So it's hard to say if goods come out like right now, like the previous time, I should say, goods coming from Italy, for example, coming out of the United States, they would not have been subjected to the tariff or the surtax, as we call it. But goods of U.S. origin would have been and were. So like that, we're trying to lead the tea leaves. I would assume it's going to be something similar, but until we know, because of this blanket issue, because the blanket takes it to another whole level if it's 25% straight across. And it's hard to tell even if it's from origin at this point. Is it origin specific or where it's coming from?
Right. And I think my comments would be that this is not necessarily specific to Canadian goods, because I think you saw the comments from the president yesterday at Davos that he's thinking about other markets too. He's thinking about Asia, China, Europe, and this whole imbalance of trade is not just a Canada matter. So I think the listeners also, regardless of what business you're operating in, you need to take a global perspective to this. Where are your goods coming from? What is the origin of those goods? Are you manipulating the goods? Are you finishing the goods in the United States? And is that content satisfactory, or would change that dynamic in any way? I think that would be my first recommendation for everybody to do.
Warrington, 100%. You also raised, and I just want to highlight it, is the HS part. Like that really is the foundational piece. So everyone hopefully will take this time. I know many U.S. companies are already doing that, but please take this time to verify your HS codes, because especially on the Canadian side, we probably, and again, we're surmising based on last time, we're more surgical about our approach. So it will be really important that those HS codes are correct, because that is really what mostly drives how that will be assessed.
Yeah. And then what I would do then is, I was pulling up some data this way. I'll just pull up some data here from, there's a tracker that's being developed up here in Canada, but I'll just take a look at the state of Ohio, for example.
That tracker is amazing. We should provide that link.
We'll provide the link to the folks here.
Yeah.
It's businessdatalab.ca, and we'll give you guys the link. But just for example, I pulled up the state of Ohio. And just to size the prize for Canada alone is like $40 billion of trade between Ohio and Canada. And that represents almost 28,000 jobs in the state of Ohio that are based on investments from the Canadian side. And so what do Ohioans send north to Canada? They send things like base metals, mineral products, vehicles, of course, and a lot of machinery, electrical products such as appliances and lawnmowers and snowblowers and all kinds of good stuff, and chemicals. And what does Ohio take from Canada? They take vehicles, the same thing, machinery, chemicals, base metals, plastics, and rubbers, right? And who's the top trading partner for Ohio? That's the province of Ontario, right? And if you take a look at it, like 34 states in the Union, their number one trade customer is Canada. So this is a very important question. So you guys can get an idea of how big the prize is and where you're located in the United States. You can pull up this data and get the facts for yourself. What I would do then is try to consider, is this a problem for me? And if it is a problem, you probably want to get with some friends and chat about it. So whether that's your local business community, local chambers of commerce, or your congressional districts, whether there's a conversation going on about this, and start to engage in that dialogue and see, what's going on. Another recommendation I would have is you probably want to think about, is there drawback? And you're going to help me with this, Kim, right? There's remissions and drawback opportunities, duty drawback opportunities that you may or may not be taking advantage of today, but you may want to take advantage of tomorrow. And how might you situate yourself within that opportunity, right?
The great point, Warrington, but I will just say I'm finding that those programs, both sides of the border, are really starting to have a lot of scrutiny.
Oh, no doubt.
Yeah, just
but I think you got to take a shot at it, right?
Correct. And in fact, if anything, it's like you got to make sure you're 100% sure of what you're doing, because you might have a bigger surprise if you claim something you weren't entitled to.
Right. So that's one thing. And then clearly, I think you also got to have a conversation with your general counsel and your tax advisors and sort of start piecing this thing together, right? So that you have the facts. So if something were to happen, you have the facts and you have the data to make a proper business decision. So that's what I had on that right now. Where we go from here, I think, is very unclear. Kim and I, we're with the Canadian Association of Importers and Exporters, and we're trying to help our members get through this as best we can. There's a number of consultations on the Canadian side taking place, and I'm sure there's a number of consultations on the U.S. side. The executive order initiated a consultation on the upcoming USMCA review and negotiations. So I think listeners should be paying attention to that and entering those conversations.
And there is work to be done there. Like, I can tell you, as somebody that's worked on a subcommittee on USMCA, just in terms of, are we actually working, meeting the agreement right now? There is definitely opportunities to make sure that all countries are meeting what they agreed to. There's definitely some certain things on the trade file that Canada and Mexico have not probably done what they should have or need to do better. But the other big one too, which was kind of shocking, and it goes across all three countries, there is committees that are struck there to talk about trade facilitation, but it doesn't include the private sector. So we're hoping that would be a level of improvement. Obviously, the private sector needs to be involved in those conversations. As a minimum, we'd like to see the readouts of those conversations. But again, those are just little examples of things that for sure we have an opportunity to improve.
Yeah, and of course, there's questions on the Mexican side too, right? Like, there's we've got a Canadian perspective here, but there have been suggestions that there's going to be tariffs applied to Mexican goods as well, right? So I think the listeners really need to take a look at that dimension of their business as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. And probably anyone in manufacturing would have to deal with all three.
Right. So, folks, I think you can see it's getting complicated. It's getting complicated. If trade wasn't already complicated before, it's getting much complicated now. I think the best advice I can give is, stay connected, right? Whether it's checking in on this the SimplyTrade podcast story or other vehicles, you want to be tucked in to at least what is going on. I think you also have to recognize people say a lot of things, and you don't necessarily need to react to what people say, but you do need to get the facts, and you need to do the research and situate yourself in a position where I understand what's going on. And if it goes this direction, I take this, I go over here and I do this with confidence, right? Rather than just sort of swinging back and forth. That's not a good place to be. So that's where we try to help our members. If you have interest in us, we're at iecanada.com. So give us a ring. We'd be glad to chat. I don't know. Kim, do you have any parting thoughts for the team here?
I think you just summarized it perfectly, Warrington. I listened to a SimplyTrade podcast that dropped, I think, Monday with Lenny and Larry and Nicole from Sandler Travis. And they kind of said this, gave some good advice that way too. Don't react to the click. I think Nicole is don't take the bait. I think that was her term. And I think Lenny also gave some really good advice about make sure that you are connected to reliable sources. We certainly see people a lot of opining or maybe not giving the best advice. So this is where it's a good time to connect to trade associations, obviously, i.e. Canada in Canada, but we know AEI, our sister organization in the US, and, NCBFA. There's so many good organizations, and really this is the time to make sure that you are connected to not only groups of professionals like yourselves, but reliable sources of information.
Yeah, and I think too. I know it's. Don't mind my dogs. I know it's complicated, but there is opportunity in this. Like if you're manufacturing a widget. And you'd only been focused on selling that widget within North America, you may have opportunity in Europe. You may have opportunity in Southeast Asia. Like there's this thing, the game is the chess pieces on the board are going to be moving around, right? And depending upon which widget you're manufacturing, someone may want that widget. So that's another area where I think people, should stay tuned. Because depending upon how this tariff thing manifests itself, I think you're going to see pockets of the world changing in terms of sourcing and supply chains. And so there's going to be a lot of movement here. And movement typically drives opportunity and change. So you want to embrace it. You don't want to sort of throw your hands up in the air and go, oh, God.
Well, the good news is we have some experience already.
We do.
So, yeah.
We do.
So I think that's helpful, actually.
We do. We
have that in our DNA now. So, and we know that we worked through it and we got through it and it made us all better. So I like you, Warrington, I feel this is an opportunity to, again, challenge ourselves as the President Trump is doing, challenging us all to ask questions and do things differently and think about things differently. That's all good stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is. And we'll be all better for it too. Because, frankly, many, many years ago, there was a situation there were duties. There were duties on everything, right? And people just had to,
I guess that might have been before our time a little bit.
Well, maybe. I'm dating myself, but I'm just like,
that I remember most things. So.
Yeah, I'm just like, maybe. But the world didn't collapse, right? So the world was trading, and I do believe, and I was following the conversations in Davos. Regardless of the situation here, global trade is projected to grow. So people will be trading, and you just want to be a part of it. That's all I'm trying to say. So.
What a great way to conclude, I think.
Yeah, I think it's been a great to be with you guys today. It's a beautiful sunny day up here, and go Bills.
Go Bills, and keep U.S. alcohol on our shelves. Please help us.
That aviation gin is fantastic. Yeah,
well, California Cab,
Yeah, exactly. And we'll keep shipping those Rev amplifiers down south to my buddies in Winnipeg.
There you go.
They're good. With that, I think we're going to say goodbye from today, and thanks for being with us today. Have a good weekend.
You too, Warrington. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you very much for joining us. SimplyTrade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor SimplyTrade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at SimplyTradePod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. SimplyTrade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by SimplyTrade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.